Hello friends, and welcome to tonight's edition of Sleep Story for Grown-Ups. Tonight I shall be reading for you the second installment of What Katy Did. We're covering chapters 5 and 6. If you would like to listen to the first 4 chapters, they're also available on this channel, and there should be a link appearing on your screen. It is time to unwind. Find a place where you can relax. Once you have settled in, take a deep breath. Your day has come to an end. There is nothing else for you to do today but listen to the story and fall asleep. And so, let us begin. Chapter 5. In the Loft. "I declare," said Miss Pentigill, laying down her work, "if them children don't beat all. What on earth are they going to do now?" Miss Pentigill was sitting in the little room in the back building, which she always had when she came to the cars for a week's mending and making over. She was the dearest, funniest old woman who ever went out sewing by the day. Her face was round, and somehow made you think of a very nice baked apple. It was so criss-crossed, and lined by 1,000 good-natured puckers. She was small and wiry, and wore caps and a false front, which was just the color of a dusty Newfoundland dog's back. Her eyes were dim, and she used spectacles, but for all that she was an excellent worker. Everyone liked Miss Pentigill, though Aunt Izzie did once say that her tongue was hung in the middle. Aunt Izzie made this remark when she was in a temper, and was by no means prepared to have Phil walk up at once and request Miss Pentigill to stick it out, which she obligingly did, while the rest of the children crowded to look. They couldn't see that it was different from other tongues, but Philly persisted in finding something curious about it. There must be, you know, since it was hung in that queer way. Wherever Miss Pentigill went, all sorts of treasures went with her. The children liked to have her come, for it was as good as a fairy story, or the circus, to see her things unpacked. Miss Pentigill was very much afraid of burglars. She lay awake half the night, listening for them, and nothing on earth would have persuaded her to go anywhere, leaving behind what she called her plate. This stately word meant 6 old teaspoons, very thin and bright and sharp, and a butter knife whose handle set forth that it was a testimonial of gratitude for saving the life of Ithuriel Johnson, aged 7, on the occasion of his being attacked with quinsy sore throat. Miss Pentigill was very proud of her knife. It and the spoons travelled about in a little basket which hung on her arm, and was never allowed to be out of her sight, even when the family she was sewing for were the honestest people in the world. Then, beside the plate basket, Miss Pentigill never stirred without Tom, a tortoise-shell cat. Tom was a beauty, and knew his power. He ruled Miss Pentigill with a rod of iron, and always sat in the rocking-chair when there was one. It was no matter where she sat, Miss Pentigill told people, but Tom was delicate, and must be made comfortable. A big family Bible always came too, and a special red merino pincushion, and some shade pictures of old Mr. and Mrs. Pentigill and Peter Pentigill, who was drowned at sea, and photographs of Mrs. Porter, who used to be Marcia Pentigal, and Mrs. Porter's husband, and all the Porter children. Many little boxes and jars came also, and a long row of phials and bottles filled with homemade physics and herb teas. Miss Pentigal could not have slept without having them beside her, for, as she said, how did she know that she might not be took sudden with something, and die for the want of a little ginger balsam or pennyroyal? The Carr children always made so much noise that it required something unusual to make Miss Pentigal drop her work, as she did now, and fly to the window. In fact, there was a tremendous hubbub, hurrahs from Dorry, stamping of feet, and a great outcry of shrill, glad voices. Looking down, Miss Pentigal saw the whole 6, no, 7, for Cecy was there too, stream out of the woodhouse door, which wasn't a door, but only a tall open arch, and rush noisily across the yard. Katy was at the head, bearing a large black bottle without any cork in it, while the others carried in each hand what seemed to be a cookie. "Catherine Carr! Catherine!" screamed Miss Pentigal, tapping loudly on the glass. "Don't you see it's raining? You ought to be ashamed to let your little brothers and sisters go out and get wet in such a way." But nobody heard her, and the children vanished into the shed, where nothing could be seen but a distant flapping of pantalettes and frilled trousers, going up what seemed to be a ladder, farther back in the shed. So, with a dissatisfied cluck, Miss Pentigal drew back her head, perched the spectacles on her nose, and went to work again on Katy's plaid alpaca, which had 2 immense zigzag rents across the middle of the front breadth. Katy's frock, strange to say, always tore exactly in that place. If Miss Pentigal's eyes could have reached a little farther, they would have seen that it wasn't a ladder up which the children were climbing, but a tall wooden post, with spikes driven into it about a foot apart. It required quite a stride to get from one spike to the other. In fact, the littler ones couldn't have managed it at all, had it not been for Clover and Cecy boosting very hard from below, while Katy, making a long arm, clawed from above. At last they were all safely up, and in the delightful retreat which I am about to describe. Imagine a low, dark loft without any windows, and with only a very little light coming in through the square hole in the floor, to which this spiky post led. There was a strong smell of corn cobs, though the corn had been taken away, a great deal of dust and spiderweb in the corners, and some wet spots on the boards, for the roof always leaked a little in rainy weather. This was the place which, for some reason I have never been able to find out, the Carr children preferred to any other on rainy Saturdays, when they could not play outdoors. Aunt Izzy was as much puzzled at this fancy as I am. When she was young, a vague, far-off time, which none of her nieces and nephews believed in much, she had never had any of these queer notions about getting off into holes and corners and poke-away places. Aunt Izzy would gladly have forbidden them to go to the loft, but Dr. Carr had given his permission, so all she could do was to invent stories about children who had broken their bones in various dreadful ways by climbing posts and ladders. But these stories made no impression on any of the children except little Phil, and the self-willed brood kept on their way and climbed their spiked post as often as they liked. "What's in the bottle?" demanded Dory the minute he was fairly landed in the loft. "Don't be greedy," replied Katy, severely. "You will know when the time comes. It is something delicious, I can assure you. Now," she went on, having thus quenched Dory, "all of you had better give me your cookies to put away. If you don't, they'll be sure to be eaten up before the feast, and then you know there wouldn't be anything to make a feast of." So all of them handed over their cookies. Dory, who had begun on his, as he came up the ladder, was a little unwilling, but he was too much in the habit of minding Katy to dare to disobey. The big bottle was set in a corner, and a stack of cookies built up around it. "That's right," proceeded Katy, who, as oldest and biggest, always took the lead in their place. "Now, if we're fixed and ready to begin, the fete," Katy pronounced it feet, "can commence. The opening exercise will be A Tragedy of the Alhambra by Miss Hall." "No," cried Clover. "First, the Blue Wizard, or Edwitha of the Hebrides. You know, Katy." "Didn't I tell you?" said Katy. "A dreadful accident has happened to that." "Oh, what?" cried all the rest, for Edwitha was rather a favorite with the family. It was one of the many serial stories which Katy was forever writing, and was about a lady, a knight, a blue wizard, and a poodle named Bob. It had been going on so many months now that everybody had forgotten the beginning, and nobody had any particular hope of living to hear the end. But still, the news of its untimely fate was a shock. "I'll tell you," said Katy. "Old Jungle Kirby called this morning to see Aunt Izzy. I was studying in the little room, but I saw him come in and pull out the big chair and sit down, and I almost screamed out, 'Don't!'" "Why?" cried the children. "Don't you see, I had stuffed Edwitha down between the back and the seat. It was a beautiful hiding place, for the seat goes back ever so far. But Edwitha was such a fat bundle, and old Jungle Kirby takes up so much room, that I was afraid there would be trouble. And sure enough, he had hardly dropped down before there was a great crackling of paper, and he jumped up again and called out, 'Bless me, what is that?' And then he began poking, and just as he had poked out the whole bundle, and was putting on his spectacles to see what it was, Aunt Izzy came in." "Well, what next?" cried the children, immensely tickled. "Oh," continued Katy, "Aunt Izzy put on her glasses too, and screwed up her eyes. You know the way she does, and she and the jungle read a little bit of it. That part at first, you remember, where Bob steals the blue pills, and the wizard tries to throw him into the sea. You can't think how funny it was to hear Aunt Izzy reading Edwitha out loud." And Katy went into convulsions at the recollection. Where she got to, "Oh, Bob, my angel Bob," I just rolled under the table and stuffed the table cover in my mouth to keep from screaming right out. By and by, I heard her call Debbie, and give her the papers, and say, "Here is a mass of trash, which I wish you to put at once into the kitchen fire." And she told me afterward that she thought I would be in an insane asylum before I was 20. It was too bad, ended Katy, half laughing and half crying. To burn up the new chapter and all, but there's one good thing. She didn't find the fairy of the dry goods box. That was stuffed farther back in the seat. "And now," continued the mistress of ceremonies, "we will begin. Miss Hall will please rise." Miss Hall, much flustered at her fine name, got up with very red cheeks. "It was once upon a time," she read. "Moonlight lay on the halls of the Alhambra, and the night, striding patiently down the passage, thought she would never come." "Who? The moon?" asked Clover. "No, of course not," replied Cece. "A lady he was in love with. The next verse is going to tell about her. Only you interrupted." "She wore a turban of silver with a jeweled crescent. As she stole down the corregidor, the beam struck it, and it glittered like stars." "So you are come, Zuleika?" "Yes, my lord." Just then a sound of steel smote upon the ear, and Zuleika's mail-clad father rushed in. He drew his sword, so did the other. A moment more, and they both lay dead and stiff in the beams of the moon. Zuleika gave a loud shriek, and threw herself upon their bodies. She was dead too. And so ends the tragedy of the Alhambra. "That's lovely," said Katy, drawing a long breath. "Only very sad. What beautiful stories you do write, Cece. But I wish you wouldn't always kill the people. Why couldn't the knight have killed the father? And no, I suppose Zuleika wouldn't have married him then. Well, the father might have. Oh, bother. Why must anybody be killed anyhow? Why not have them fall on each other's necks and make up?" "Why, Katy?" cried Cece. "It wouldn't have been a tragedy then. You know the name was A Tragedy of the Alhambra." "Oh, well," said Katy hurriedly, for Cece's lips were beginning to pout, and her fair, pinkish face to redden, as if she were about to cry. "Perhaps it was prettier to have them all die. Only I thought, for a change, you know. What a lovely word that was, corregidor. What does it mean?" "I don't know," replied Cece, quite consoled. "It was in the conquest of Granada. Something to walk over, I believe." "The next," went on Katy, consulting her paper, "is Yap, a simple poem by Clover Carr." All the children giggled, but Clover got up composedly and recited the following verses. "Did you ever know Yap, the best little dog, who ever sat on lap, or barked at a frog? His eyes were like beads, his tail like a mop, and it wagged as if it never would stop. His hair was like silk, of the glossiest sheen. He always ate milk, and once the cold cream. Off the nursery bureau, that line is too long. It made him quite ill, so endeth my song. For Yappy, he died just 2 months ago, and we oughtn't to sing at a funeral, you know." The poem met with immense applause. All the children laughed and shouted and clapped till the loft rang again. But Clover kept her face perfectly and sat down as demure as ever, except that the little dimples came and went at the corners of her mouth. Dimples partly natural and partly, I regret to say, the result of a pointed slate pencil, with which Clover was in the habit of deepening them every day while she studied her lessons. "Now," said Katy, after the noise had subsided, "now come scripture verses by Miss Elsie and Joanna Carr. Hold up your head, Elsie, and speak distinctly. And, oh, Johnny, you mustn't giggle in that way when it comes your turn." But Johnny only giggled the harder at this appeal, keeping her hands very tight across her mouth and peeping out over her fingers. Elsie, however, was solemn as a little judge, and with great dignity began. "An angel with a fiery sword came to send Adam and Eve abroad, and as they journeyed through the skies, they took one look at paradise. They thought of all the happy hours among the birds and fragrant bowers. And Eve she wept, and Adam bawled, and both together loudly squalled. Dory snickered at this, but sedate Clover hushed him. "You mustn't," she said. "It's about the Bible, you know. Now, John, it's your turn." But Johnny would persist in holding her hands over her mouth, while her fat little shoulders shook with laughter. At last, with a great effort, she pulled her face straight, and, speaking as fast as she possibly could, repeated in a sort of burst. "Balaam's donkey saw the angel and stopped short in fear. Balaam didn't see the angel, which is very queer." After which she took refuge again behind her fingers, while Elsie went on. Elijah by the creek, he by ravens fed, took from the horny beak pieces of meat and bread. "Come, Johnny," said Katy. But the incorrigible Johnny was shaking again, and all they could make out was, "The bears came down and ate and ate." These verses were part of a grand project on which Clover and Elsie had been busy for more than a year. It was a sort of rearrangement of Scripture for infant minds, and when it was finished, they meant to have it published, bound in red, with daguerreotypes of the two authoresses on the cover. "The Youth's Poetical Bible" was to be the name of it. Papa, much tickled with the scraps which he overheard, proposed instead the Trundlebed Book, as having been composed principally in that spot. But Elsie and Clover were highly indignant, and would not listen to the idea for a moment. After the Scripture verses came Dory's turn. He had been allowed to choose for himself, which was unlucky, as his taste was peculiar, not to say gloomy. On this occasion he had selected that cheerful hymn which begins, "Hark, from the tombs a doleful sound," and he now began to recite it in a lugubrious voice, and with great emphasis, smacking his lips, as it were, over such lines as, "Princess, this clay shall be your bed, in spite of all your towers." The other children listened with a sort of fascinated horror, rather enjoying the cold chills which ran down their backs, and huddling close together, as Dory's hollow tones echoed from the dark corners of the loft. It was too much for Philly, however. At the close of the piece, he was found to be in tears. "I don't want to stay up here and be groaned at," he sobbed. "There, you bad boy," cried Katy, all the more angry because she was conscious of having enjoyed it herself. "That's what you do with your horrid hymns, frightening us to death and making Phil cry." And she gave Dory a little shake. He began to whimper, and as Phil was still sobbing, and Johnny had begun to sob too, out of symphony with the others, the feat in the loft seemed likely to come to a sad end. "I'm going to tell Aunt Izzy that I don't like you," declared Dory, putting one leg through the opening in the floor. "No, you aren't," said Katy, seizing him. "You're going to stay, because now we are going to have the feast. Do stop, Phil, and Johnny, don't be a goose, but come and pass round the cookies." The word feast produced a speedy effect on the spirits of the party. Phil cheered at once, and Dory changed his mind about going. The black bottle was solemnly set in the midst, and the cookies were handed about by Johnny, who was now all smiles. The cookies had scalloped edges and caraway seeds inside, and were very nice. There were two apiece, and as the last was finished, Katy put her hand in her pocket, and amid great applause, produced the crowning addition to the repast: 7 long brown sticks of cinnamon. "Isn't it fun?" she said. "Debbie was real good-natured today and let me put my own hand into the box. So I picked out the longest sticks there were. Now, Cece, as your company, you shall have the first drink out of the bottle." The something delicious proved to be weak vinegar and water. It was quite warm, but somehow drank up there in the loft, and out of a bottle it tasted very nice. Besides, they didn't call it vinegar and water. Of course not. Each child gave his or her swallow a different name, as if the bottle were like Signor Blitz's, and could pour out a dozen things at once. Clover called her share raspberry shrub. Dory christened his ginger pop, while Cece, who was romantic, took her 3 sips under the name of Heidammel, which she explained was something nice, made, she believed, of beeswax. The last drop gone, and the last bit of cinnamon crunched, the company came to order again, for the purpose of hearing Philly repeat his one piece: "Little drops of water," which exciting poems he had said every Saturday as far back as they could remember. After that, Katy declared the literary part of the feat over, and they all fell to playing stagecoach, which, in spite of close quarters and an occasional bump from the roof, was such good fun that the general "Oh dear" welcomed the ringing of the tea-bell. I suppose cookies and vinegar had taken away their appetites, for none of them were hungry, and Dory astonished Aunt Izzy very much by eyeing the table in a disgusted way, and saying, "Pshaw, only plum sweetmeats and sponge cake and hot biscuit. I don't want any supper." "What ails the child? He must be sick," said Dr. Carr, but Katy explained. "Oh, no, Papa, it isn't that. Only we've been having a feast in the loft." "Did you have a good time?" asked Papa, while Aunt Izzy gave a dissatisfied groan, and all the children answered at once, "Splendiferous." Chapter 6. Intimate Friends. "Aunt Izzy, may I ask Imogen Clark to spend the day here on Saturday?" cried Katy, bursting in one afternoon. "Who on earth is Imogen Clark? I never heard the name before," replied her aunt. "Oh, the loveliest girl. She hasn't been going to Mrs. Knight's school but a little while, but we're the greatest friends. And she's perfectly beautiful, Aunt Izzy. Her hands are just as white as snow, and no bigger than that. She's got the littlest waist of any girl in school. And she's real sweet, and so self-denying and unselfish. I don't believe she has a bit good times at home, either. Do let me ask her." "How do you know she's so sweet and self-denying if you've known her such a short time?" asked Aunt Izzy in an unpromising tone. "Oh, she tells me everything. We always walk together at recess now. I know all about her, and she's just lovely. Her father used to be real rich, but they're poor now, and Imogen had to have her boots patched twice last winter. I guess she's the flower of her family. You can think how I love her," concluded Katy sentimentally. "No, I can't," said Aunt Izzy. "I never could see into these sudden friendships of yours, Katy, and I'd rather you wouldn't invite this Imogen, or whatever her name is, till I've had a chance to ask somebody about her." Katy clasped her hands in despair. "Oh, Aunt Izzy," she cried, "Imogen knows that I came in to ask you, and she's standing at the gate at this moment, waiting to hear what you say. Please let me, just this once. I shall be so dreadfully ashamed not to." "Well," said Mrs. E., moved by the wretchedness of Katy's face, "if you've asked her already, it's no use my saying no, I suppose. But recollect, Katy, this is not to happen again. I can't have you inviting girls, and then coming for my leave. Your father won't be at all pleased. He's very particular about whom you make friends with. Remember how Mrs. Spencer turned out." Poor Katy. Her propensity to fall violently in love with new people was always getting her into scrapes. Ever since she began to walk and talk, Katy's intimate friends had been one of the jokes of the household. Papa once undertook to keep a list of them, but the number grew so great that he gave it up in despair. First on the list was a small Irish child named Marianne O'Reilly. Marianne lived in a street which Katy passed on her way to school. It was not Mrs. Knight's, but an ABC school to which Dory and John now went. Marianne used to be always making sand pies in front of her mother's house, and Katy, who was about 5 years old, often stopped to help her. After this mutual pastry, they grew so intimate that Katy resolved to adopt Marianne as her own little girl and bring her up in a safe and hidden corner. She told Clover of this plan, but nobody else. The two children, full of their delightful secret, began to save pieces of bread and cookies from their supper every evening. By degrees, they collected a great heap of dry crusts and other refreshments, which they put safely away in the garret. They also saved the apples, which were given them for 2 weeks, and made a bed in a big empty box, with cotton quilts and the dolls' pillows out of the baby house. When all was ready, Katy broke the plan to her beloved Marianne, and easily persuaded her to run away and take possession of this new home. "We won't tell Papa and Mamma till she's quite grown up," Katy said to Clover. "Then we'll bring her downstairs, and won't they be surprised? Don't let's call her Marianne any longer either. It isn't pretty. We'll name her Susquanna instead, Susquanna Carr. Recollect, Marianne, you mustn't answer if I call you Marianne, only when I say Susquanna." "Yes'm," replied Marianne very meekly. For a whole day all went on delightfully. Susquanna lived in her wooden box, ate all the apples and the fresh cookies, and was happy. The two children took turns to steal away and play with the baby, as they called Marianne, though she was a great deal bigger than Clover. But when night came, and nurse swooped on Katy and Clover and carried them off to bed, Miss O'Reilly began to think that the garret was a dreadful place. Peeping out of her box, she could see black things standing in corners, which she did not recollect seeing in the daytime. They were really trunks and brooms and warming pans, but somehow, in the darkness, they looked different, big and awful. Poor little Marianne bore it as long as she could, but when at last a rat began to scratch in the wall close behind her courage gave way entirely, and she screamed at the top of her voice. "What is that?" said Dr. Carr, who had just come in and was on his way upstairs. "It sounds as if it came from the attic," said Mrs. Carr, for this was before Mamma died. "Can it be that one of the children has got out of bed and wandered upstairs in her sleep?" No, Katy and Clover were safe in the nursery, so Dr. Carr took a candle and went as fast as he could to the attic, where the yells were growing terrific. When he reached the top of the stairs, the cries ceased. He looked out. Nothing was to be seen at first. Then a little head appeared over the edge of a big wooden box, and a piteous voice sobbed out, "Ah, Miss Katy, and indeed I can't be staying any longer. There's rats in it." "Who on earth are you?" asked the amazed doctor. "Sure, I'm Miss Katy's and Miss Clover's baby, but I don't want to be a baby any longer. I want to go home and see my mother." And again the poor little midget lifted up her voice and wept. I don't think Dr. Carr ever laughed so hard in his life as when, finally, he got to the bottom of the story and found that Katy and Clover had been adopting a child. But he was very kind to poor Susquehanna and carried her downstairs in his arms to the nursery. There, in a bed, close to the other children, she soon forgot her troubles and fell asleep. The little sisters were much surprised when they waked up in the morning and found their baby asleep beside them, but their joy was speedily turned to tears. After breakfast, Dr. Carr carried Marianne home to her mother, who was in a great fright over her disappearance, and explained to the children that the garret plan must be given up. Great was the mourning in the nursery, but as Marianne was allowed to come and play with them now and then, they gradually got over their grief. A few months later, Mr. O'Reilly moved away from Burnett, and that was the end of Katy's first friendship. The next was even funnier. There was a queer old woman who lived all alone by herself in a small house near the school. This old woman had a very bad temper. The neighbors told horrible stories about her, so that the children were afraid to pass the house. They used to turn always just before they reached it, and cross to the other side of the street. This they did so regularly that their feet had worn a path in the grass. But for some reason Katy found a great fascination in the little house. She liked to dodge about the door, always holding herself ready to turn and run in case the old woman rushed out upon her with a broomstick. One day she begged a large cabbage of Alexander, and rolled it in at the door of the house. The old woman seemed to like it, and after this Katy always stopped to speak when she went by. She even got so far as to sit on the step and watch the old woman at work. There was a sort of perilous pleasure in doing this. It was like sitting at the entrance of a lion's cage, uncertain at what moment His Majesty might take it into his head to give a spring and eat you up. After this, Katy took a fancy to a couple of twin sisters, daughters of a German jeweler. They were quite grown up and always wore dresses exactly alike. Hardly anyone could tell them apart. They spoke very little English, and as Katy didn't know a word of German, their intercourse was confined to smiles and to the giving of bunches of flowers, which Katy used to tie up and present to them whenever they passed the gate. She was too shy to do more than just put the flowers in their hands and run away. But the twins were evidently pleased, for one day, when Clover happened to be looking out of the window, she saw them open the gate, fasten a little parcel to a bush, and walk rapidly off. Of course she called Katy at once, and the two children flew out to see what the parcel was. It held a bonnet, a beautiful doll's bonnet of blue silk, trimmed with artificial flowers. Upon it was pinned a slip of paper with these words in an old foreign hand: "To the nice little girl who was so kindly to give us some flowers." You can judge whether Katy and Clover were pleased or not. This was when Katy was 6 years old. I can't begin to tell you how many different friends she had set up since then. There was an ash man and a steamboat captain, There was Mrs. Sawyer's cook, a nice old woman, who gave Katy lessons in cooking and taught her to make soft custard and sponge cake. There was a bonnet maker, pretty and dressy, whom, to Aunt Izzie's great indignation, Katy persisted in calling Cousin Estelle. There was a thief in the town jail, under whose window Katy used to stand, saying, "I'm so sorry, poor man," and "Have you got any little girls like me?" in the most piteous way. The thief had a piece of string which he let down from the window. Katy would tie rosebuds and cherries to the string, and the thief would draw them up. It was so interesting to do this that Katy felt dreadfully when they carried the man off to the state prison. Then followed a short interval of Cornelia Parham, a nice, good-natured girl, whose father was a fruit merchant. I am afraid Katy's liking for prunes and white grapes played a part in this intimacy. It was splendid fun to go with Cornelia to her father's big shop, and have whole boxes of raisins and drums of figs open for their amusement, and be allowed to ride up and down in the elevator as much as they liked. But of all Katy's queer acquaintances, Mrs. Spencer, to whom Aunt Izzie had alluded, was the queerest. Mrs. Spencer was a mysterious lady whom nobody ever saw. Her husband was a handsome, rather bad-looking man who had come from parts unknown, and rented a small house in Burnett. He didn't seem to have any particular business, and was away from home a great deal. His wife was said to be an invalid, and people, when they spoke of him, shook their heads and wondered how the poor woman got on all alone in the house, while her husband was absent. Of course, Katy was too young to understand these whispers, or the reasons why people were not disposed to think well of Mr. Spencer. The romance of the closed door and the lady whom nobody saw interested her very much. She used to stop and stare at the windows and wonder what was going on inside, till at last it seemed as if she must know. So one day she took some flowers and Victoria, her favorite doll, and boldly marched into the Spencers' yard. She tapped at the front door, but nobody answered. Then she tapped again. Still nobody answered. She tried the door. It was locked. So, shouldering Victoria, she trudged round to the back of the house. As she passed the side door, she saw that it was open a little way. She knocked for the third time, and, as no one came, she went in, and, passing through the little hall, began to tap at all the inside doors. There seemed to be no people in the house. Katy peeped into the kitchen first. It was bare and forlorn. All sorts of dishes were standing about. There was no fire in the stove. The parlor was not much better. Mr. Spencer's boots lay in the middle of the floor. There were dirty glasses on the table. On the mantelpiece was a platter with bones of meat upon it. Dust lay thick over everything, and the whole house looked as if it hadn't been lived in for at least a year. Katy tried several other doors, all of which were locked, and then she went upstairs. As she stood on the top step, grasping her flowers, and a little doubtful what to do next, a feeble voice from a bedroom called out, "Who is there?" This was Mrs. Spencer. She was lying on her bed, which was very tossed and tumbled, as if it hadn't been made up that morning. The room was as disorderly and dirty as the rest of the house, and Mrs. Spencer's wrapper and nightcap were by no means clean, but her face was sweet, and she had beautiful curling hair, which fell over the pillow. She was evidently very sick, and altogether Katy felt sorrier for her than she had ever done for anybody in her life. "Who are you, child?" asked Mrs. Spencer. "I'm Dr. Carr's little girl," answered Katy, going straight up to the bed. "I came to bring you some flowers," and she laid the bouquet on the dirty sheet. Mrs. Spencer seemed to like the flowers. She took them up and smelled them for a long time without speaking. "But how did you get in?" she said at last. "The door was open," faltered Katy, who was beginning to feel scared at her own daring. "And they said you were sick, so I thought perhaps you would like me to come and see you." "You are a kind little girl," said Mrs. Spencer, and gave her a kiss. After this, Katy used to go every day. Sometimes Mrs. Spencer would be up and moving feebly about, but more often she was in bed, and Katy would sit beside her. The house never looked a bit better than it did that first day, but after a while Katy used to brush Mrs. Spencer's hair and wash her face with the corner of a towel. I think her visits were a comfort to the poor lady, who was very ill and lonely. Sometimes, when she felt pretty well, she would tell Katy stories about the time when she was a little girl and lived at home with her father and mother. But she never spoke of Mr. Spencer, and Katy never saw him except once, when she was so frightened that for several days she dared not to go near the house. At last, Cecy reported that she had seen him go off in the stage with his carpet-bag. So Katy ventured in again. Mrs. Spencer cried when she saw her. "I thought you were never coming any more," she said. Katy was touched and flattered at having been missed, and after that she never lost a day. She always carried the prettiest flowers she could find, and if anyone gave her a specially nice peach or a bunch of grapes, she saved it for Mrs. Spencer. Aunt Izzy was much worried at all this, but Dr. Carr would not interfere. He said it was a case where grown people could do nothing, and if Katy was a comfort to the poor lady, he was glad. Katy was glad too, and the visits did her as much good as they did Mrs. Spencer. For the intense pity she felt for the sick woman made her gentle and patient as she had never been before. One day she stopped, as usual, on her way home from school. She tried the side door. It was locked. The back door. It was locked too. All the blinds were shut tight. This was very puzzling. As she stood in the yard, a woman put her head out of the window of the next house. "It's no use knocking," she said. "All the folks have gone away." "Gone away where?" asked Katy. "Nobody knows," said the woman. "The gentleman came back in the middle of the night, and this morning, before light, he had a wagon at the door, and just put in the trunks and the sick lady, and drove off. There's been more than one a-knocking beside you since then. But Mr. Pudgett, he's got the key, and nobody can get in without going to him." It was too true. Mrs. Spencer was gone, and Katy never saw her again. In a few days it came out that Mr. Spencer was a very bad man, and had been making false money, counterfeiting, as grown people called it. The police were searching for him to put him in jail, and that was the reason he had come back in such a hurry and carried off his poor sick wife. Aunt Izzy cried with mortification when she heard this. She said she thought it was a disgrace that Katy should have been visiting in a counterfeiter's family. But Dr. Carr only laughed. He told Aunt Izzy that he didn't think that kind of crime was catching. And as for Mrs. Spencer, she was much to be pitied. but Aunt Izzy could not get over her vexation, and every now and then, when she was vexed, she would refer to the affair, though this all happened so long ago that most people had forgotten all about it, and Philly and John had stopped playing at putting Mr. Spencer in jail, which for a long time was one of their favorite games. Katy always felt badly when Aunt Izzy spoke unkindly of her poor sick friend. She had tears in her eyes now as she walked to the gate, and looked so very sober that Imogen Clark, who stood there waiting, clasped her hands and said, "Ah, I see. Your aristocratic aunt refuses." Imogen's real name was Elizabeth. She was rather a pretty girl, with a screwed-up, sentimental mouth, shiny brown hair, and a little round curl on each of her cheeks. These curls must have been fastened on with glue or tin tacks, one would think, for they never moved, however much she laughed or shook her head. Imogen was a bright girl, naturally, but she had read so many novels that her brain was completely turned. It was partly this which made her so attractive to Katy, who adored stories, and thought Imogen was a real heroine of romance. "Oh, no, she doesn't," she replied, hardly able to keep from laughing at her idea of Aunt Izzy's being called an aristocratic relative. "She says she shall be my but here Katy's conscience gave a prick, and the sentence ended with, um, um, so you'll come, won't you, darling? I am so glad." "And I," said Imogen, turning up her eyes theatrically. From this time on, till the end of the week, the children talked of nothing but Imogen's visit, and the nice time they were going to have. Before breakfast on Saturday morning, Katy and Clover were at work building a beautiful bower of asparagus boughs under the trees. All the playthings were set out in order. Debbie baked them some cinnamon cakes. The kitten had a pink ribbon tied round her neck, and the dolls, including Pickery, were arrayed in the best clothes. About 10:30, Imogen arrived. She was dressed in a light blue barège, with low neck and short sleeves, and wore coral beads in her hair, white satin slippers, and a pair of yellow gloves. The gloves and slippers were quite dirty, and the barège was old and darned, but the general effect was so very gorgeous that the children, who were dressed for play, in gingham frocks and white aprons, were quite dazzled at the appearance of their guest. "Oh, Imogen, you look just like a young lady in a story," said simple Katy. Whereupon Imogen tossed her head and rustled her skirts about more than ever. Somehow, with these fine clothes, Imogen seemed to have put on a fine manner, quite different from the one she had used every day. You know, some people always do when they go out visiting. You would almost have supposed that this was a different Imogen, who was kept in a box most of the time and taken out for Sundays and grand occasions. She swam about and diddled and lisped and looked at herself in the glass, and was generally grown up and airy. When Aunt Izzy spoke to her, she fluttered and behaved so queerly that Clover almost laughed. And even Katy, who could see nothing wrong in the people she loved, was glad to carry her away to the playroom. "Come out to the bower," she said, putting her arm round the blue barège waist. "A bower!" cried Imogen. "How sweet!" But when they reached the asparagus boughs, her face fell. "Why, it hasn't a roof, or pinnacles, or any fountain," she said. "Why, no, of course not," said Clover, staring. "We made it ourselves." Oh, said Imogen. She was evidently disappointed. Katy and Clover felt mortified. But as their visitor did not care for the bower, they tried to think of something else. Let us go to the loft, they said. So they all crossed the yard together. Imogen picked her way daintily in the white satin slippers. But when she saw the spiked post, she gave a scream. "Oh, not up there, darling, not up there," she cried. "Never, never." "Oh, do try. It's just as easy as can be," pleaded Katy, going up and down half a dozen times in succession, to show how easy it was. But Imogen wouldn't be persuaded. "Do not ask me," she said affectedly. "My nerves would never stand such a thing. And besides, my dress." "What made you wear it?" said Philly, who was a plain-spoken child, and given to questions, while John whispered to Dory, "That's a real stupid girl. Let's go off somewhere and play by ourselves." So, one by one, the small fry crept away, leaving Katy and Clover to entertain the visitor by themselves. They tried dolls, but Imogen did not care for dolls. Then they proposed to sit down in the shade and cap verses, a game they all liked. But Imogen said that though she adored poetry, she never could remember any. So it ended in their going to the orchard, where Imogen ate a great many plums and early apples, and really seemed to enjoy herself. But when she could eat no more, a dreadful dullness fell over the party. At last Imogen said, "Don't you ever sit in the drawing-room?" "The what?" asked Clover. "The drawing-room," repeated Imogen. "Oh, she means the parlor," cried Katy. "No, we don't sit there except when Aunt Izzy has company to tea. It's all dark and poky, you know. Besides, it's so much pleasanter to be outdoors. Don't you think so?" "Yes, sometimes," replied Imogen doubtfully. "But I think it would be pleasant to go in and sit there for a while now. My head aches dreadfully, being out here in this horrid sun." Katy was at her wit's end to know what to do. They scarcely ever went into the parlor, which Aunt Izzy regarded as a sort of sacred place. She kept cotton petticoats all over the chairs for fear of dust, and never opened the blinds for fear of flies. The idea of children with dusty boots going in there to sit! On the other hand, Katy's natural politeness made it hard to refuse a visitor anything she asked for. And besides, it was dreadful to think that Imogen might go away and report, "Katy Carr isn't allowed to sit in the best room, even when she has company." With a quaking heart, she led the way to the parlor. She dared not to open the blinds, so the room looked very dark. She could just see Imogen's figure as she sat on the sofa, and Clover twirling uneasily about on the piano stool. All the time she kept listening to hear if Aunt Izzy were not coming, and altogether the parlor was a dismal place to her. Not half so pleasant as the asparagus bower, where they felt perfectly safe. But Imogen, who, for the first time, seemed comfortable, began to talk. Her talk was about herself, such stories she told about the things which had happened to her. All the young ladies in the ledger put together never had stranger adventures. Gradually, Katy and Clover got so interested that they left their seats and crouched down close to the sofa, listening with open mouths to these stories. Katy forgot to listen for Aunt Izzy. The parlor door swung open, but she did not notice it. She did not even hear the front door shut when Papa came home to dinner. Dr. Carr stopping in the hall to glance over his newspaper, heard the high-pitched voice running on in the parlor. At first he hardly listened. Then these words caught his ear. "Oh, it was lovely, girls, perfectly delicious. I suppose I did look well, for I was all in white, with my hair let down, and just one rose, here on top." And he leaned over me and said in a low, deep tone, "Lady, I am a brigand, but I feel the enchanting power of your beauty. You are free." Dr. Carr pushed the door open a little farther. Nothing was to be seen but some indistinct figures, but he heard Katy's voice in an eager tone. "Oh, do go on. What happened next?" "Who on earth have the children got in the parlor?" he asked Aunt Izzie, whom he found in the dining room. "The parlor?" cried Miss Izzie wrathfully. "Why, what are they there for?" Then, going to the door, she called out, "Children, what are you doing in the parlor? Come out right away. I thought you were playing outdoors." "Imogen had a headache," faltered Katy. The three girls came out into the hall, Clover and Katy looking scared, and even the enchanter of the Brigand quite crestfallen. "Oh," said Aunt Izzie grimly, "I am sorry to hear that. Probably you are bilious. Would you like some camphor or anything?" "No, thank you," replied Imogen meekly. But afterwards she whispered to Katy, "Your aunt isn't very nice, I think. She's just like Jacquima, that horrid old woman I told you about, who lived in the Brigand's cave and did the cooking." "I don't think you're a bit polite to tell me so," retorted Katy, very angry at this speech. "Oh, never mind, dear, don't take it to heart," replied Imogen sweetly. "We can't help having relations that ain't nice, The visit was evidently not a success. Papa was very civil to Imogen at dinner, but he watched her closely, and Katy saw a comical twinkle in his eye, which she did not like. Papa had very droll eyes. They saw everything, and sometimes they seemed to talk almost as distinctly as his tongue. Katy began to feel low-spirited. She confessed afterward that she should never have got through the afternoon if she hadn't run upstairs 2 or 3 times and comforted herself by reading a little Rosamond. "Aren't you glad she's gone?" whispered Clover, as they stood at the gate together, watching Imogen walk down the street. "Oh, Clover, how can you?" said Katy, but she gave Clover a great hug, and I think in her heart she was glad. "Katy," said Papa next day, "you came into the room then exactly like your new friend Miss Clark." "How? I don't know what you mean," answered Katy, blushing deeply. "So," said Dr. Carr, and he got up, raising his shoulders and squaring his elbows, and took a few mincing steps across the room. Katy couldn't help laughing. It was so funny, and so like Imogen. Then Papa sat down again and drew her close to him. "My dear," he said, "you're an affectionate child, and I'm glad of it. But there is such a thing as throwing away one's affection. I didn't fancy that little girl at all yesterday. What makes you like her so much?" "I didn't like her so much yesterday," admitted Katy reluctantly. "She's a great deal nicer than that at school sometimes." "I'm glad to hear it," said her father, "for I should be sorry to think that you really admired such silly manners. And what was the nonsense I heard her telling about brigands?" "It really began Katy. Then she caught Papa's eye and bit her lip, for he looked very quizzical. "Well," she went on laughing, "I suppose it didn't really all happen, but it was ever so funny, Papa, even if it was a make-up. And Imogen's just as good-natured as can be. All the girls like her." "Make-ups are all very well," said Papa, "as long as people don't try to make you believe they are true. When they do that, it seems to me it comes too near to the edge of falsehood to be very safe or pleasant. If I were you, Katy, I'd be a little shy of swearing eternal friendship to Miss Clark. She may be good-natured, as you say, but I think 2 or 3 years hence she won't seem so nice to you as she does now. Give me a kiss, chick, and run away, for there's Alexander with the buggy."